Yes, so welcome everybody. I'm Sarah Blowin. I'm one of the other conveners of the Lent Conversations for Churches Together, worshipping at Alma Church across the road. So welcome. This is our third talk in our conversation series for 2025. We've already had two powerful and hopefully empowering talks. And so very much looking forward to Dave's talk tonight. Before I introduce you to Dave Wiles, just a few words about the context of this talk. When we were planning this year's theme, we really wanted to look at urban violence and knife crime. As you will all be too horribly aware, 2024 was particularly sad in this respect, and serious violence involving knives in Bristol was up 38% on the previous year, claiming the lives of several young men and boys in our city. Obviously, there were some highly mediatised cases that we can probably all remember. So how should churches and people of faith respond, and how can we try to influence outcomes? Of course, we're not the first people to ask these questions, and this year, 2025, is the 40th anniversary of the groundbreaking report, Faith in the City. And you may remember this. It was the Church of England's response to the social dislocation and inner city violence in some of the UK's poorest areas, including in Bristol, that took place in the early 1980s. Now, the terms of reference of the Faith in the City report were to examine the strengths, insights, problems and needs of the Church's life and mission in urban priority areas, and, as a result, to reflect the challenge which God may be making to the Church and nation, and to make recommendations to the appropriate bodies. Now, the resulting report was one of the most substantial documents on welfare provision and urban mission in post-war Britain. It spoke truth to power by challenging the government of the day, think who that was in the early 80s, and to rethink their policies where they were adversely affecting urban communities up and down the country. And its findings and recommendations are still relevant today and are going to be revisited in a series of events this anniversary year run by the Urban Theology Union and the William Temple Foundation. So do look out for those. And it is those two august bodies who said, if you want someone to talk about this topic, Dave's your man. So over to Dave Wiles. Now, the issues of social justice that led to the Faith in the City report were also those that challenged Dave to be called to radical community work on the housing estate in Bath where he was living in the 1970s. Dave worked in youth justice until he retired quite recently, and along the way he was CEO of the Frontier Youth Trust, which may be familiar to some of you. He has worked in a range of other human services with marginalised people and has written about this in Stories from the Edge and other books. We have copies of this book at the back for purchase afterwards. Dave was on probation when he was 12, but he's come good and gone on to work with troubled young people for the last half a century, and he suspects that any abilities he has in working with people, it's less about the social work qualifications and the MPhil that he has picked up along the way, and more about what he calls personal helper therapy, using his own work with others to unravel his own turbulent adolescence. Now, Dave uses stories from his own experience to reflect on his passionate belief that faith is spelt risk. In his talk tonight, Dave will offer ideas for engagement in our communities and encourage the notion that God is more interested in our availability than our ability. So, Dave, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you. How lovely. I wonder if you'll clap afterwards. Lovely to be here, and I've met some of you and chatted, which was lovely. So many smiling faces, which I love seeing in a church. I was at the seaside, Weston-super-Mud, with my son once, and he said, "Dad, are the donkeys Christians?" I said, "I don't know. Why do you ask?" He said, "They've all got long faces." But it's lovely to be here, and what I find exciting is different groups of Christians together. I always said that I don't think the word denomination was appropriate. I think it's denomination I've often changed to demonation. I think, all those things that separate us, that we get het up. How many angels can you get on the head of a pin? And all the interesting red herrings that we like to chew over. They're nonsense, aren't they? We've got Baptists, I imagine, we've got Anglicans, RUC, URC, sorry. Sure. You're not the RAC, are you? My car, I got trouble with my car. Yeah, all sorts, charismatics, asthmatics, we're all here, aren't we? It's lovely. And it's great to be with you. I really hope what I bring you tonight will be helpful. I'm not going to give you any specific ideas about what you should do, but what I want to do is talk about some of the principles that I think are critical in terms of walking a path of peace. So it's lovely to be with you. Thank you. And I was on holiday last week, and I was thinking about you all, and I took the unusual step. I'd never do this. I'm always I kind of fairly shoot from the hip, or from the lip when I do talks. But I prepared an opening statement for you, which I'd like to hear. Are you impressed? Thank you. Right, here we go. I'm going to read it to you. I like being referred to as a patron saint of ne'er-do-wells, but I confess the title is undeserved. I'm no saint. I gravitate to young people who get in trouble out of empathy rather than sympathy. I find the only way to understand young people is to connect. These are the critical words, okay? It's about engagement. It's about understanding. It's about being alongside. It's about accompanying. In my 52 years, that is, well over half a century now, of youth and community work, I have never met the stereotypes I've encountered about young people. I've never met them. But they abound. Stereotypes want to generalize and simplify behavior. They want to prescribe or punish it. Of course, I've got sympathy for victims, but I've never yet met a young offender who has not been a victim themselves. Beneath the tip of the iceberg of their behavior lies uncertainty, lack of attachment, trauma, a bunch of systemic factors that Faith in the City pointed out, and a host of other hidden demons. Of course, the demons are easy to condemn, but it can take time to help young people understand them and make the necessary exorcism. So, how to respond? Here's the principles, okay? What path of peace to take? Well, it takes love over gold. It takes mind over matter. As Leonard would say, ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And to add to Mr. Cohen's wonderful words, far be it from me to add to his words, I'd add it's how the light gets out too. The light comes and goes when we're open to the pain of the world. The objective is participation, not perfection. It's the creation of interdependence, not independence. It's cooperation, not crusades. It's the realization that God requires our availability rather than our ability. It's joining in with God, what God is doing, knowing that God will be there long after we've gone. That was God then just saying, listen. It is the knowledge that faith is spelled R-I-S-K. So I hope that my few stories today will help you to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. I always have to remember that, but the way I remember it is I got it tattooed on my arm. So I've got a Banksy on there that tells me I've got to act justly, and on this one I've got another Banksy that says I have to love mercy, and on my leg I've got walk humbly. It's an half hurt as well. Anyway, it's lovely to be. I mean, some of my story involves quite a kind of traumatic past, you know. It was kind of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And I sometimes say to people now, as I get older, I find I only need 3 shops: Specsavers, Boots, and Greggs. My life is just specs and drugs and sausage rolls. Oh dear. Well, it's lovely to be with you. I've got a clicky thing here that Ian gave me, and I've got some notes here. I'll try and stay with them. I'll try and stay with you. So, Dave, that's me. Who am I? In terms of, what I often do with groups of Christians is say, if you had an icon, you know, like those pictures you have on your computer, or if you're Orthodox, like a proper icon, which is a window into something else, I wonder what your icon for your faith would be. You can think about that. If I get boring, you can just think, I wonder what my icon is. And I often say to people, I've got this icon. This is my faith icon. It's from Toy Story. And it's that point, you know, where Buzz Lightyear's got Woody on his back, and Buzz is flying because he's got a rocket firing out his back. And Woody says, Buzz, he's getting really excited. You're flying. And Buzz says, this isn't flying, this is falling with style. And my faith journey is really very much about falling in style. What I profess is that God requires of me honesty. Jesus said truth sets people free. And I'm pretty sure, you'll have to ask him when you see him, but I'm pretty sure he didn't mean theological truth. I don't even think he meant academic truth. I think he meant honesty. Honesty. And I think that's what Leonard Cohen talked about in his song. The cracks, you know, the stuff that's hurt us, the stuff that's caused us pain, the past that, you know, did its troubles. It's when we allow that to come under the influence of the redemption of the Holy Spirit, it's when we let the crack, you know, the light comes in. And I found that time and time again. So, you know, I'm a vagabond, a wastrel, a mistake in many ways. But what I found is that when I'm honest with people, whether it's adults that I'm counselling, or whether it's tomorrow I'll be on the streets of Yeovil working with young people, training detached youth workers, it's honesty that works. It's being authentic. It's being real. And I kind of think when Jesus said to his disciples, as the Father sent me, so I send you. I don't think that was just saying you're going off on a mission. I think he was saying in the same way that God sent me, I'm sending you. And the way in which God sent Christ was that he took on himself the form of a servant and became obedient and did what he felt God was telling him to do. He was authentic with people. And he was the way, the truth, and the life, which is wonderful, isn't it? Anyway, let's get on with a little bit of my story. So you've got a sense of who. These are pictures that kind of connect with my past. That's me and my dad on the right-hand side, and on the left is one of Her Majesty's Hotel. I'm not sure which one it is. It could be Wadsworth or it could be Parker's, I'm not sure. But my dad did 27 years in prison when I was growing up. Don't be too surprised, it was in the days when you got 7 years for receiving stolen property. You know, so he was absent for a lot of my childhood in one prison or another. And he drove for the Cray brothers. You heard of the Crays? So he used to drive getaway cars for them. So he was a bit of bit of a character. And in many ways, that kind of influenced who I was to become. You know, we didn't go out on Sunday outings for in the countryside or down the seaside. He used to take me out on a job. I often tell people, I remember once he took me out to steal some cement, because he was a builder. And I say, we were hardened criminals. See what I did there? Anyway, that was a funny story, because as we put the cement in the boot of his car, he shut the boot and my finger was still in it. And of course it was dark and I couldn't shout because, you know, we had to stay quiet. And I got into quite a few scrapes with him. And as Caroline, is it? That's right. I got her name right. Sarah, that's my age. It's my age, Sarah, sorry. As Sarah said, back in those days, my first ever official offence, I'd broken into a house. I wasn't a very good burglar, like my dad. No one lived in it. It had just been built, and there was no one there. And the friend and I that broke in decided, with the pots of paint that were still there, we would redecorate it. And halfway through our exploits, when there was a knock at the door, we answered it. Rubbish burglars. And so at 12, I had a probation officer coming around. This is before the days of the Youth Justice Act. So kids like 12-year-old, I could get probation. And they said things like, oh, your dad's in prison, you must be paying society. But I thought, that's a great story, so I'll take that. Anyway, the magistrate didn't think that. They put me straight on probation. And that was, in a way, the beginning of a lot of crime. I got involved with drugs by the time I'm 15. Soft drugs to begin with, but then by the end of my use of different chemicals, I'd used everything other than heroin, so opium, mescaline, LSD, all of those drugs. I was selling drugs around bars to people. I was fighting a lot. That's why I put a picture of, do you know the film Clockwork Orange? Do you remember that? My name in Bath was Alex, because some of the hippies that I mixed with met me one night, and I was wearing a Prince of Wales check Crombie, which was covered in blood. So they started to call me Alex. So when I was growing up, I was Alex. So you can see I'm on a kind of dodgy path to peace. You know, I'm certainly understanding something of what violence is about. You know, I was attacked by a guy with a knife when I'm 16, broke his jaw, and I put people in hospital for 3 days in comas. So you can see I'm kind of a fairly turbulent adolescence, quite confused, influenced by all manner of things. You know, if you get a chance, watch, have any of you watched Adolescent yet on Netflix, yeah? Worth watching. That whole really underlines the complexity of adolescence and the fact that young people now are growing up in a world we don't understand. Gerard Kelly in his book talks about the fact that youth workers are immigrants in the world of the young people they work with. And that sums it up well. It's a very different world. And the trick is how to connect with that. Anyway, I didn't stay in that phase of my life, you'll be glad to know. I've never even been tempted to go back to it. On the basis that I entered what Douglas Adams calls the total perspective vortex. I went to a big meeting, about 10 times the size of this, full of people, on my own. Long story, I can't tell you it all now, it would take too long. But the guy at the front told a story about Jesus and about a God of love and compassion. And I'd always thought God was a celestial spoilsport, you know, out to put me down if I did anything I enjoyed. But the way this guy explained who God was and what Jesus had done, whoa, it broke my heart. It broke my heart. I was, you know, and it was one of those things where there's an altar call at the end, you know. It was wonderful. So I'm sat at the back. As soon as he said, come at the front if you want Jesus, I was there. And I tell you, it was like every drug I'd ever taken at once. A profound turning of inside out. No longer the center of the universe. I was right on the edge of it where I belonged, and I knew that God loved me, that God wanted to forgive me, and that God had stuff for me to do, which was amazing. And I went then into the desert, Is this the next slide I want? Oh. Yeah, I went into the desert. Which way? Which was my path to peace? And the desert for me was the church. Now, I'm not going to be rude about the church. I'm not going to diss the church. You ever seen that thing, if you point the finger at someone, there's three pointing back at you, isn't there? Those three. You've got to watch it if you're going to blame people. But what happened is I had two conversions. The first one was to Christ, when I understood what the gospel was, what the good news was. The second was to the group that I joined. Jose Marins, in Basic Ecclesiastical Communities, writes about this. He says, Christians very often have two conversions, one to Christ and then to the group. So I joined a group. It was lovely. I loved the people dearly. It was a kind of brethren church that was a little bit looser than the Plymouth Brethren are typically. And they were so loving and kind. And for a year, I ate quiche. I went to Bible studies. I memorized the scriptures. I could tell you some scriptures. You could check me out later on. I got some memorized scriptures here that will stay with me forever. I ate and drank religion. And after about a year, I thought, there's something wrong. I'm dressing differently. My language code has changed slightly. It's become a bit more elaborate, as Basil Bernstein would point out in his sociological book. My values have changed slightly. What about all the, all my mates? They're back in the city centre in the Bell, down the Oak. They're in different pubs and clubs. And it was too late, because I've had my second conversion to the group. I thought, if I go back, they're going to think I'm backsliding. At this point, I always think it'd be lovely if I could do the moonwalk. Michael Jackson, moonwalk, like backsliding. I'm going back to my old ways. And they're going to reject me. And it's not wrong, they didn't have designs on me in terms of attachment, but I'd grown so attached to that understanding of my faith that I didn't know what to do. I had a crisis in my faith. This is very arrogant. I told God that God had to tell me what I was to do. And I was in church that night at the Young People's Fellowship. But where else would you be? And I saw the Bible at the front of the church. And I thought, I know, you tell me what I should do, and I'm going to go and read it now. So I walked to the front of the church, the big old family Bible. I flipped it open and read the first thing that I read. And it said, get up, make haste, and go into the city. I hadn't got a clue about the context of where I read it, but it was pretty clear that I had to make an effort and go. So I did. I left the church. I said to the youth worker, I'm going back into town, don't worry, I won't be drinking cider. I'm going back to see my mates. And it was amazing, because the connections and the conversations with young people that would have, wouldn't darken the door of the church, were profound. And again, it was back to honesty. Yeah, this is what I found, this is what I'm trying to do, this is what I'm trying to follow with my life. So I think God is really interested in us being willing to go. I started to pray for the estate where I grew up. And at that time, there was a professor of social administration called Bob Holman, who was at Bath University. Amazing guy, written about 30 books. Sadly, no longer with us. But at the time I was praying for the young people in my streets, and I was going back into town to talk to my friends, Bob decided that his faith had become a bit academic and remote. So he left the university and moved into the estate where I was. And I thought, whoa. And he ended up coming to the church that I went to, and he ended up becoming, of course, my mentor 50-odd years ago. Because he was a Christian who put his faith on the line. And his family did the same. His wife and his children made amazing commitments to move into the estate to try and set up a community project. Now, when he met me, he thought I was the answer to his prayer, because I gave him a bit of street cred with some of the ne'er-do-wells on the street. And when I met him, I thought he was the answer to my prayer, because he'd come and he was going to do something on my estate. And it wasn't long before we were running 35 different youth groups a week. Bob and Annette opened their home to local people. And for 10, 15 years, we had the most amazing experiences. And I wanted to say to you something about Bob's style of work, really, because I think that is quite challenging. Firstly, he was willing to go. It's worth noting that the first two letters of the word gospel are go. It's not come, because constable doesn't sound right, does it? Go. He was willing to go with him and his family. Secondly, he listened. He connected with the community I was in. He spent more time in the local shop chatting to people and listening and soaking up what they were experiencing and what they felt should be done. I've got a friend called Simon Chaplin, who works in New Zealand on a massive street, which is kind of centre of Auckland's sex industry. You know, it's got drug cafes and sex cafes and da-da-da. And as a Baptist minister, he's an amazing guy. He's a white guy, Baptist minister. I don't know if you know him. Dreadlocks. And he decided God was calling him to that street. So I said to him, Simon, what did you do? He said, for a year, I was Simon and I sniffed out the purposes of God. I sniffed out the purposes of God. He connected with people. He listened to people. And he responded to their concerns with them. Not for them, but with them. And I always think that's kind of profound. It's about being ourselves. Again, the liberation theologians, when they talk about mission, they say there's only 3 important questions in terms of understanding mission to people. Who am I? Who are you? Who are we? It's about connections. It's about listening. You don't have to be clever. You don't have to go in with a strategy to whiz-bang, the community, rescue it. The agenda is to join in. Bob used words like reciprocity and mutuality. Lovely words. Dignity, partnership, sharing power. That was how Bob worked. He was wonderful. In a nutshell, I messed up there. Pressed the wrong button. Sorry, my mistake. It's the round one. Oh, there we go. Look, oh, you're a star. You know what you're doing. In a nutshell, it's about this, if I can get it. Oh, there we go. There it is. Oh, look, I've blown. I was going to say to you, do you know about this theological principle? There. And I was going to say, I wonder if anyone can see what it says. But I gave it away. Did you see it? Oh, you did. So, it's actually about putting love into action. It's about love in action. And I think there's some key principles to that love, and I'm just going to run through them with you. The first one is engagement. And here's a story about being in Bristol for you. I was, when I was chief exec of Frontier Youth Trust, one of the things I decided was important was something called interaction. What was it? I called it active reflection. And basically what it was is I spent 3 days on a pilgrimage with a friend. I didn't have money. I didn't have plans. All I did was wanted to listen to what people were saying and what God was saying. And it was an amazing experience. And the story I want to share with you is coming into Bristol from Bath. And we'd just been, I was obviously with a friend. You've got to be safe about doing this stuff. And we didn't know where to sleep that night. And we're walking through Brislington, down the edge of Brislington, and I saw a car wheel spinning up and down this cul-de-sac. You could smell the weed out of the windows. And the 3 lads inside the car were drinking Triple X. And Lawrence and Lawrence was my friend who I was with, decided we would walk over the street, avoid them. And it's at the point we got to the other side of the road, I said to Lawrence, is there a parable about this? And he said, yeah, you're right. I said, we shouldn't. We need to engage. So we walked back over the street, thankfully, and these guys were amazing. What are you doing? We're on a pilgrimage. What's a pilgrimage? Well, we're trying to listen to God and do that sort of stuff. Oh, why? That's right. Anyway, do you know anywhere we could sleep tonight? And these guys said, yeah. Arno's Vale. The cemetery. And they said, you'll be safe in there. You can have a fire. It'll keep you warm. And then he looked at me and Lawrence, and all we carried were these light bags. We didn't have anything to start a fire or do anything. He said, but you need something to burn. So he's got all this newspaper in the back of his car. He's given us all this newspaper. He said, you'll find some wood in the trees, or there's some wooden crosses in there you can burn. No, they didn't say that. I made that up. But, and then he said, how are you going to light your fire? And I said, I don't know. Anyway, this is what happened. He gave me this. He gave me his lighter. And it had those tasty words written all over it. And for me, it was a kind of touchstone moment where I thought, young people, I was going to avoid these kids. And they've looked after me. They've engaged. We've connected. And as we're walking away, the lad said, before you go, mate, will you say a prayer for us? So next thing you know, we're praying with these three lads on the edge of Arno's Vale Cemetery. And then we spent the most uncomfortable night of our life sleeping in the cemetery. But that lighter became a touchstone. We can write young people off. They're hedonists. They're only interested in self. But he gave me his lighter. And he didn't think twice. And I still got it. And I look at it and I remember young people aren't all there cracked up to be in terms of the media. And it was a lovely, lovely experience. The way in which we engage, am I doing all right for time? Personal. So engagement is important. Secondly, it's personal. And again, a quick story. When I went to the Bronx, and I'm going to see a priest in the Bronx after I'd done some training in Baltimore, which is 50 kilometres, whatever it is, down the coast. And I'm going to see a priest, and I get out of the subway, and I'm feeling a bit edgy, because I'm obviously a tourist. I'm the only white person in the Bronx, I think, which was a great experience for me in terms of what it's like to be a minority. Because I felt anxious. No one was threatening me, but I felt anxious. And I saw a black lady at the bus stop. I still see her. She's a big, lovely lady. And I said, does the number 45 stop here? She said, yeah. So I put my suitcase down, and then I had a hair on the back of the neck moment. Do you know? Do you ever get those? It's kind of like X-Files, really. Something's wrong. Something's not right. And I didn't know what to do. I wasn't going to say to the lady, are you sure 45 stops here? So I said a prayer. Lord, is this the right bus stop? And as I'm praying, a car drives by and shouts, there's a little boy, Dave! Who do I know in the Bronx? Anyway, it's another priest who I'd been in Baltimore with, who happened to be driving by as I was praying. He said, you going to see Father Peter? I said, yeah. He said, the bus stop's on the other side of the road. And I thought, whoa. Now, I'm not offering you that story as a illustration of the theology of prayer. I don't understand it at all. I don't know how God gets time to answer my queries about bus timetables. Don't ask me. It's too much. But what I do know, as I walked across the road, I thought about that verse. Fear not, you're worth more than many sparrows. And I felt a sense in which I was to ensure that people knew that God is personal. There's so much stuff in the world that's holding people down. But God is interested. Now, the thing is, your and my role is not to connect them with my God or your God. It's to connect them to God. It's about accompanying them on their journey into God. Not your God. I don't want people to take their faith from me and my stories. I want them to have authentic encounters with a real God. And that God cares about everyone personally. I know it. Also, it's simple. It's easy to make it complex, isn't it? I met a guy on the streets and sat down to chat to him. connecting. And we were talking for a while, telling each other stories. I gave him one of my cigarettes. I gave him my bottle light, it was cold. I gave him my gloves, it was cold. In the end, I gave him my coat, and I gave him some money. And we chatted for about half hour. And as I walked away, do you know what? He never thanked me for one of those things. He said, thanks for listening to me. And that was the priority, someone that would listen to him. The therapeutic value of your ears is not to be underestimated. You sometimes think, I don't do enough for God. Listen to people. Listen to people with God's ears, with God's heart, with God's wisdom. That's all it requires, simplicity. And it's unconditional. I'm nearly there. Am I doing all right for time? Are you all right? I don't want to mess up this. I've only got a few more stories. I want you to know it's, what did I say there? Unconditional. That's Mother Teresa, you know her, don't you? Lovely. The danger is that Christians get stuck on deserving and undeserving. God's love's unconditional. I went and saw a guy called Ray Backy in Chicago, who runs a church there. Amazing work with women who are involved in the sex industry, a bit like the old 125 project, which you've got in Bristol, dear old Val Gill, amazing. And Ray was saying that the women who were involved in the sex industry had a problem because they were often leaving their kids to go out and work. So what he's a Baptist minister, they're the best. He set up a babysitting service, so his congregation were going to go and look after the kids. And again, it was unconditional. He was very clear, Ray, don't try to evangelise people by doing stuff with them. Just do the stuff. Show the love. And the amazing thing is that it wasn't long before several of those women got involved in education programs in the church, and it did have a knock-on effect in terms of social things. It's about being, it's about making yourself available. Sometimes it's about being a bit vulnerable. It's about being unconditional. Aunt Dorothy, who's a heroine of mine, worked in Bath. She was an evangelist, 84 years old, buck teeth, Canadian, knee-high to a grasshopper, a ministry to Hell's Angels in Bath. And I say to her, how do you do it, Aunt Dorothy? What do you do? Well, she'd lived in Bath for 50 years. And the way she did it was that she approached people in leather jackets, etc., smoking spliffs, and she'd ask them for directions. She knew Bath like the back of her hand. She said, where's Milsom Street? And, and next thing you know, she'd be entering into a conversation. There'd be listening, there'd be conversing, there'd be laughing. And then on the Sunday morning, she'd be taken to Hell's Angels to Hay Hill Baptist Church, one on each arm, She started with her own needs. She became vulnerable and connected to people. And I think that very often that's all that's asked of us. It's about balance. I told you, these are one of my tattoos there, isn't it? It is about social. The brilliant Faith in the City report. It is about balancing those two things. John Stott said, you can't separate social and spiritual. They're like two wings on a bird. They're like two parts of a pair of scissors. There needs to be a social and a spiritual connection. I worked with a young person who had a serious cocaine problem, and I did all the social stuff. I listened to him. I trained in social work by that time, offered him some advice and guidance and support. And at the end of it, our conversation, I said, of course, the other thing you can remember is you can pray. Just a little scene at the end of a whole massive social intervention. Anyway, I met him the next day. He said, Dave, I was craving for some crack last night. And I said, well, what happened? He said, I remember what you said. And I prayed. And I thought, whoa, he's had a kind of, road to Damascus experience. I said, what happened? He said, well, I said the Lord's Prayer, because he's a Catholic. I said the Lord's Prayer and I fell asleep. And then he said, but it worked, didn't it? He didn't get his coat. He didn't get his Coke, and then we carried on the conversation. I was able to get him into a kind of semi-rehab situation. But it's about connecting, and it's about balancing social and spiritual. You know, it's about connecting, and about not being defensive. I love, John, you know, in terms of that social thing, connecting with, I do street pastoring. Very often people know that they're Christians. I don't believe in God. And I think John Stott hit the nail on the head when he said, the response to that is, which God don't you believe in? And you'll find very often people don't believe in, they don't believe in the God that we know. They've got all these made-up stories that have been handed on to them through their experience. And through the dodgy theology of the church. Oh, no, I didn't say that. Fine, we're nearly there. We really are nearly there. I don't want to... Oh, here we go. I'll finish with this story because it's 7:10. I should have finished 5 minutes ago. New Zealand farmer went to Australia, very impressed with their sheep farms, and says to the Australian farmer, I'm so impressed. You've got more sheep than we've got, and they look really healthy, but I'm very confused. I can't see any fences anywhere. And the Australian farmer said, there aren't any fences because we look after the waterholes. There are no fences, we look after the waterholes. Now, in a sense, my challenge to you tonight is to say, what does that mean in terms of faith? You know, the danger is that people feel kept out. You know, we've been too busy with fences. And the question is, what do the waterholes look like on the path to peace? You know, with those that are at risk and those that are troubled. And it's a good question to ask yourself. Where are the waterholes? How are we looking after them? Les Isaac says, the dangers with church is that we want people to believe differently, then we want them to behave differently, and then they can belong. His point is that actually we need to reverse that thinking. How do we enable people to belong, to connect with what we've got? That may then change their beliefs, and that may then change their behaviour. It's kind of up to us, really. The young wise man approached the old wise man with a bird in his hand and said, "Old man, is this bird dead or alive?" And the old man said, "The answer is in your hands." The answer is in... So my challenge to you tonight is get on the path of peace, connect with what God's doing, and see what happens. All right?
Well, thank you so much, Dave. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to just ask you to... So, what was your last question to everybody again? Would you like to give it to them again? Because we'll ask people to have a chat with their neighbour for a few minutes.
Or find a stranger. Talk to a stranger. They're only friends who aren't met, if you're Buddhist, but... So chat through each other, and if you've got any things you want to work out to ask me questions, how long have we got?
I haven't got to watch.
1:15.
We're fine. We're fine, aren't we? We're fine. So we'll give you a few minutes to chat, and then we'll come back and you can put your questions today.
Great.
Right, shall we see whether we've got any questions or comments, observations for Dave? Sam's got the roving mic, so if you put your hand up. So Pearl at the back to start us off.
I've got a couple of questions actually, but let's start with one of them. I wonder what you would say about the latest thinking on knife crime and the making of a medical model of knife crime.
I think a couple of things. One is, I've done some research into gang membership and stuff like that, which is available online. Understand the context. That tip of the iceberg is the knife crime. What's going on beneath it? Well, for many young people, it's about self-preservation, and it's about membership and loyalty. Now, I'm not advocating people should carry knives, but the research suggests that kids carry them because they feel insecure and unsafe. I've worked with young people who do carry knives. I've taken knives off kids. I've even taken a gun off a kid. Because what I find is I wouldn't advocate you going out looking for people carrying guns and knives, but I kind of feel confident with it. I've always found that when I talk about risk, and I talk about caring for them, and I say, look, we can get rid of this. The gun went in the river with no one knowing, and that's dodgy in terms of safeguarding stuff. And knives I've taken off kids, they've given me them. They've wanted to be free from it. So, just be careful. Don't write off, and don't think that it's the availability of the knife that is the problem. Whether it's samurai swords or those horrible knives they use, they'll get knives. The kitchen knives are freely available. It's not, again, I think the availability of dangerous knives and trying to close it down is a red herring, because there will always be knives around, So, yeah, tricky one, isn't it? Certainly on the increase. Yeah.
Is anybody burning to, or should I ask my second one? Okay, the second one was also a quickie. I wonder what you thought of what Gareth Southgate said last week about the need for mentors and role models for every youngster.
Wonderful. Well, yeah, I ran a project when I was in FYT called Out for Good. We worked with young recidivists, kids who are going to come out of prison and are going to reoffend and will be back in prison. 80% of young people who go into prisons will commit further crimes, at least 80%. Sometimes it's higher. And those prisons cost us an arm and a leg, I'll tell you. We set up a project called Out for Good, and all we did was we provided three things. We provided somewhere to live, so we connected with kids in prisons, got them somewhere to live, got them a job or something to do, and finally, critically, a voluntary mentor. And what we found is that we completely reversed the trend on recidivism. When instead of 80% of them going back to prison, 80% of them didn't go back. Those kids we were working with over that period, which was about 7 to 10 years, didn't go back to prison. And so I think it's critical that we find ways to give young people connections with safe, tolerant, understanding adults. Really, really, really important. And it worked for us. That project, by the way, I got money from the lottery for it. It cost, I think, over the years we ran it, over $1 million. And it involved a lot of Christian volunteers. But we worked out, in terms of the young people who didn't go back to prison, it saved over 200 million in terms of what they would pay. We have full prisons because we have prisons. Prisons are residential institutions that have to be full, otherwise they're not financially viable. Think about it. When Labour came in and, when you started shifting people out of prisons, there is much more scope for us to use community enforcement, tagging, but certainly give them someone to talk to they can trust. Do you want that? Sorry, the microphone? No. Can you do this lady and then this lady? Thanks.
Yes, I wondered if you would like to comment on the impact of kind of online social media culture. There was something on the news actually today, and it's been in the States as well, about the sort of toxic impact of young people encouraging other young men, often encouraging young women to self-harm and so forth. That's
a really good question. It's horrendous. I said to you earlier that Gerard Kelly said we're immigrants in the world of the young people we work with. And that is one of the huge changes, that actually, I was talking to a friend this morning about bullying. Bullying for us happened at school. You left it there, went home. You may have recovered a bit or talked, But now, bullying is in your pocket. It's in your pocket. And there are kids who are not, which is why that film Adolescence is worth watching, because you get a real sense of what's happening to young people, the whole thing about shaming. the whole thing about the way men see women, masculinity, the whole business of, fears about sexuality, sexual behaviour, mental health, huge issues. And in many ways, I suppose for us, what I would advise you, if you're interested in working with young people, ask them about it. We can speculate together and I can offer you ideas, but the best way to find out how young people are affected by social media, chat with them about it. You never know what will come out. This way, isn't it?
Did I hear you correctly that in fact your project lasted for about 7 to 10 years, i.e. you worked with a young person for that length of time?
Yeah.
Because one of the things that worries me, if we look at it from a societal point of view, is projects get changed, they rarely last. We've seen it with overseas aid and so on and so forth. So how did you manage to get it? Yes. That's
brilliant. Yeah, and we live in a world, we're on a conveyor belt in terms of social care, really. The whole business, it's competitive tendering. I had to fight for that money over the 10 years it was running. I'd make friends with officials in the lottery, get them to come out and see it. I went to the Home Office to tell them what we were doing. I said, you should be doing this. Never happened. And I think that's because of the investment in an institution. But you're absolutely right. So the way in which I think there's been longevity in that project is carried on is because the volunteers have been committed to it. And it has continued. I think that the residential side of it, getting people houses and jobs, has suffered, but with the loss of money. But the mentoring carried on. So there was but you're absolutely right. There's a word I quite like called iatrogenesis, which is the idea that sometimes our interventions can be the problem. So thalidomide is the best example of iatrogenesis. We introduce a drug which helps, but then causes thalidomide. And sometimes our well-meaning Christian projects parachute in and out of neighbourhoods, and they don't do anything other than create dependence. So I think you should start stuff thinking about the end of it. But on the other hand, don't be scared to try it. It's worth thinking about endings, though. Yeah.
I don't know whether people are aware, but there's another problem with young men. Bullying and ill-treating their mothers.
Oh, yeah.
And you don't hear much about it.
No, you're
and it's a real problem.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. Do you know of any projects that are doing work on that?
I don't know.
No.
I've been retired for 20 years, that's the trouble. But it was coming to my notice.
If we were in Bath, I would say go to the Southside project. That they do some great work on domestic violence, but it works. It's not just about men on women. It can be about children on parents. And I've worked with children who are bullying their family. And like that film, Adolescence, the reasons for that are incredibly complex. And in some ways, it can take an expert to unravel. But on the other hand, don't be afraid to listen and, offer us. And also to signpost someone to, it's worth knowing what's going on in Bristol. You'll have social care directories, I'm sure. Sometimes the best work I've done has been to suggest someone goes to DHI because they've got a serious drug problem or alcohol problem. So signposting is a good ministry. You don't feel you have to do something yourself. Think about how you can find something that can help. Yeah, thank you. Good question. Cool.
Dave, two things. One, so about a T-shirt. I like the T-shirt. What's the image?
Say that again.
Your T-shirt, the image on it. What's it about?
Oh, this is, I think this is the Odin. If I remember rightly, I've got, my alter ego really is Thor.
Yeah.
I kind of identify with Thor.
Yeah, I thought you might, yeah.
So Odin's, I've always been fond of him. And to be honest, when I was 7, 8, I rescued a raven. And I looked after it, and I could be seen going around the estate with a raven on my shoulder. So I've always had a fondness for ravens. That's where it comes from.
Now, Dave, I don't look like Yvette Cooper, but if I'm Yvette Cooper now, and I'm Home Secretary, and I'm saying to you, Dave, tell me the 3 things I have to do in government to help your observations, your work, to honour your work, to help the people here do the best we can do. What are the 3 things you would say,
3 things.
Do this?
Yeah.
Or 2 things, or 1 thing?
I would say focus on community development. Don't focus on rescue projects all the time. Rescue projects are brilliant, but how can you enable people to take action on their own issues and concerns? And we did have a thing called community development, which really, really can be important and can avoid the thing about things coming and going. So I would say do that. Secondly, I would say, release resources to people. And I forgot a third wish. I don't want to waste it. I don't know. This is saying that my third wish, I suppose, would be to get the Liberals in. Probably. I don't. I mean, I'm disappointed with politics. Full stop. I like. If you're interested, I think. What's his name? Stuart Murray. He does stuff on community organising. I trained in community organising, and I think that is brilliant. Whereby people are encouraged to become politically active, have fun, and change things in their own neighbourhood. So I would try, community development, community organising, and make sure the resources are consistent. I think we could do with some long-term research into the impact of community work. We've never had, the work Bob did was brilliant. It's very anecdotal rather than academic. So I do think we need to look at how you ensure that things can be sustained in a way that continues to be relevant to local people. Yeah.
Any more questions for Dave? Well, I'm going to ask you the question then that you say everybody always asks you, but obviously these are not normal people, are they?
Normal.
What about your dad?
What about me dad, yeah. So just ever so briefly, I'll tell you his story. The ending story, really. He got lung cancer 25 years ago, and was told he had three months to live. Now, we'd had ongoing debate. In my early faith years, of course, I knew all the answers. Nowadays, I say I believe more and more about less and less. I was so certain of my faith, and we had a big discussion about who Jesus was and why Jesus was important. And my dad, it was really interesting, said, he would say things like, he would quote Paul at me. Paul says on Mars Hill, we're all God's offspring. And he would talk about the childhood of people. Everyone's part of God. Jesus is nothing special. And I said, oh, okay, then. Well, I beg to differ. And we had these lovely, lovely debates. And in the end, one day, not long before he died, he said to me, Dave, I started praying to Jesus. And he didn't have any fear of death, by the way. He's a spiritualist. And it was really interesting. In the last few months of his life, I found he also made a commitment to Christ at a Billy Graham rally in London when he was younger. So there was this faith thing in him, but he'd become a spiritualist and was talking to the people in the afterlife and all that stuff. But he says to me, yeah, Dave, I started praying to Jesus. And I'm kind of saying, whoa. And I tried to be clever. I said, what does Jesus say to you? And he said, he doesn't say a lot, but he listens. And it was lovely. And then he's getting closer and closer to his death. There's 9 children at that time. 7 of us were alive, stood around him as he was going. And my brother gave me my dad's Bible over. I remember getting it off my shoulder, and he said, "Read something, Dave." My dad was struggling, drowning slowly from lung cancer, and so I opened the Bible. I did my thing again. It's funny, it only works for me a couple of times in life, but the verse I read when I opened it, again, I didn't choose this. It said, "Believe in God, believe also in me. I go to prepare a place for you." If I go, I will come again and receive you to myself. And as I read those words, my dad sat bolt upright, looked at the window, I laid hands on him and said, Lord, take my dad, and he died. Like that. And I've done that 3 times for people to die. So whatever you do, don't ask me to pray for you tonight. I did the same for my sister. I did the same for my mum. And when my brother-in-law was dying, I said to my sister, do you want me to pray for him? She said, no, I'll do it. She laid hands on him, and he died. It's like instant messenger of death. Brilliant. So that's my dad's story.
Our appreciation for Dave, his clarity. Thank you. And bringing amazing passion into really simplifying what could be a really complex and overthought topic for us. So thank you very much for that, Dave. Thank you.